It is my pleasure to introduce Dorothee Greenberg. She's a professor emeritus right now, or just on sabbatical leave from Pace University. And this has been her dream, to learn about the Underground Railroad. And we have so many people, I know everyone must be fascinated by this subject. So welcome, Dorothee, and thank you for coming here.
Well, I, as you learned, I was a professor at Pace University, and I was raised in Maine, the least diverse state in the Union. And I decided, when I came to teach in New York and had a lot of African-American students, I decided I have to learn about African-American history. And I was taking a course at NYU on how to teach diversity, and was coming up the stairs in the Pleasantville train station and bumped into Pleasantville historian Bert Ruiz. And I said, was there ever slavery in Pleasantville? And he said, oh, yes. And the Underground Railroad went right through Pleasantville. So I had to research that. And of course, the difficulty with the Underground Railroad is that it was illegal, because the people who were helping the fugitives, many people felt that they were stealing property. So it's hard to get reliable evidence, but I felt that a wonderful evidence was Sharp's history. There's a letter from his son written in 1939 about their efforts. Their portraits of Esther and Moses Pierce upstairs in the Chappaqua meeting house on Quaker Road. So you can see them there. And then we will learn about the cross-Atlantic exchange of ideas, because where did the idea come from that slavery was terrible? And there were many American abolitionists, brave ones. And then we will learn about stops on the fugitives' path. And again, some of it we just have to surmise, because everything was clandestine and carefully kept out of records. But we do have some documented stops. Next. One of the best pieces of evidence was 1886, the year of Pierce's death. Historian John Todd wrote of him in Sharp's History of Westchester County. Early convinced with his entire family of the injustice and wrong of slaveholding, Pierce cheerfully met the odium and danger, there was real danger, attendant upon such a course at the time, and together with his son speeded many fugitives along the mythical track of the Underground Railroad to the next station at the J Homestead en route for Canada. Next. This is one of the portraits that's upstairs in the meeting house in Chappaqua. And Quakers, if you've ever, it really pays to visit a Quaker meeting house, because it's the opposite of what we expect at a church. There are no saints, no velvet pillows, no prayer books, and no portraits. But in the Chappaqua meeting house, there are portraits of Moses Pierce, and his father was an abolitionist in Pleasantville. Next. And his wife, Esther Carpenter Pierce, of New Rochelle. And they married in 1840 in New Rochelle in a Quaker marriage ceremony, which is very interesting. But remember the date 1840. I kind of use that as an anchor to find out what happened before and what happened after. Next. So this is a map that shows the stops that we have, and a question mark after the stops that we're not sure about. David Ruggles, we don't have any positive evidence, but David Ruggles, we will learn later, spent several months. He really had very many medical problems, many of them created by brutality in Manhattan. And he went to recuperate with the Carpenters in New Rochelle. We have no evidence that the fugitives who started with him came to Pleasantville, but very probable. Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, Elias Hicks in Long Island, we'll see all of that. Joseph Carpenter in New Rochelle was, of course, Esther's father, very interesting man. Moses Pierce in Pleasantville, and the building is still standing. The John Jay home in Bedford, and David Irish in Quaker Hill. And just recently, I got evidence that the Stephen Meyer home in Albany, Stephen Meyer was an African-American, a free Black who helped many people. And we have a letter from his wife to Jay, thanking them for money and requesting more money. Next. So where did I was wondering, where did these ideas to end slavery in America come from? And we have the cross-Atlantic exchange of ideas next, where we had several people traveling back and forth. A very interesting man I encountered in my research was John Wesley, who founded the Methodist movement and witnessed slavery in Georgia and wrote thoughts on slavery. He was very interesting to me because he started preaching in England, and the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England, the most respected church, did not allow prostitutes in their pews and poor people. And actually, the Anglican Church, the Episcopalians, had made a lot of money, even in America, on the slave trade. And Wesley preached in America against slavery. And next. Another marvelous person was William Wilberforce. Unbelievable. The people I met in this research was really inspiring. And one of them was William Wilberforce, not to mention, of course, John Wesley. He was a friend of William Pitt. Tirelessly, he collected 5,000 petitions against slavery and succeeded in ending the African slave trade and slavery in the British Commonwealth in 1833. Now, notice when he died, he was a very sickly man, suffered all kinds of illnesses, but he was on horseback getting those petitions signed. And in 1833, he died 3 days after slavery was ended in the British Commonwealth. Why did he die 3 days afterwards? I think he was waiting to live to see the triumph of his ideas. And you can see a movie about him. Very, very nice. Next. Another fascinating man is Olaudah Equiano. He was captured in what is now Nigeria with his sister and dragged at the age of 10 and dragged into slavery and bought his freedom from a Quaker, married an English woman, and made a lot of money writing his autobiography. He was a very widely traveled man. And I'm sure that Moses and Esther, you know, Quakers are very well-educated people. Even the women study and read. So they very probably read his interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. And this was published worldwide. And Olaudah made a lot of money publishing his autobiography. Now, looking at Olaudah, what was it about Africans? And, you know, we don't have an open stage, so you can't answer right now. What was it about Africans that made them so appealing for enslavement? And I have my own answer. I think that the fact is that they were visually identifiable. And even today, I think there's a book called One Drop. If a human being reveals one drop of African descent, then they are African American and subject to, unfortunately, much oppression. Next. Another guy, very interesting man, was Marquis de Lafayette, a gorgeous guy, even with his gorgeous uniform, came to America at the age of 19. And when he revisited in 1824, he said, you know, there's a really surprising change in the visage of the enslaved. They've changed color. They're so much lighter. The slave trade had ended in 1808, and slave owners who counted on creating their own wealth through slavery, slave labor, and slave labor, once the slave trade was illegal, even though it did continue in New York City after that, but one way to increase your slavery was to have sex with your enslaved woman, and any child born to an enslaved woman would become your property that you could sell, abuse, exploit, etc. So that's why the Africans changed color. When he worked with George Washington, Africans were Black, and African Americans have come in a great variety of shades. Next. And I'm just giving Henry Louis Gates Jr. as an example, a marvelous guy whom you've probably seen on TV with the Ancestry.com and so forth. And he's a professor of African and African American studies in Harvard. He's done fabulous documentaries about the history of African, and he is, like Barack Obama, 50% European, 50% Irish. And next. So who were the American abolitionists, the most significant ones? One was John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who traveled to France for the Jay Treaty. And he visited with Wilberforce, and Columbia actually has a collection of some of his correspondence with Wilberforce. His son and grandson supported Moses, and his son and grandson, I don't know the exact details, but I think several of them were educated by Quakers. So John Jay liked the Quakers. Next. One delightful, fascinating man was Elias Hicks. He was a Quaker living on Long Island, and Long Island had a lot of Quakers, and many of the Quakers who came to Westchester County actually were born in Long Island. He was an itinerant Quaker preacher, traveling 35,000 miles in his life on horseback. He was, unlike Wilberforce, I think he was quite healthy. And I'm guessing that what happened was that as he traveled, he would get a free dinner at the next Quaker meeting house where he preached. We know from his records that he preached in Purchase, which is near where the Carpenters worshipped. He preached in Chappaqua, and he preached on Quaker Hill. So among many others, I think he also preached in New Jersey, Ohio, but we know that he was there. So Moses and Esther very probably heard him. On his deathbed in July, somebody said, let's put a nice cotton blanket on him. And he said, oh no, I do not want a cotton blanket. I want a wool blanket. I will not use anything that was created by slave labor. And so, I don't know, he's one of my favorite people. Thought he was so cute. He looks very serious. Next. And of course, you've probably heard about William Lloyd Garrison, orator and publisher of The Liberator. He was from Massachusetts, and he traveled all over the country. And he was the one who discovered Moses, who discovered Frederick Douglass on Nantucket in one of his speaking. I'm reading here some of the questions, and we'll get to that where Moses Pierce, where we have one house in Pleasantville, which was Pleasantville, but is now Thornwood. And okay, we'll get to that. Next. Frederick Douglass was also an American abolitionist. In preparation for this presentation to Chappaqua, I decided I better read his biography. I'd read his autobiography, and I hope everybody has read the first autobiography that he wrote. But the biography by David Blight, I find just fascinating. He was a marvelous orator. He was born enslaved. He started to learn how to read and write by his owner's wife. And one day his owner's wife walked in and said, if you teach him how to read and write, he will never be a slave. So instantly the wife became very cruel, very nasty, kept all paper and pencil away from him. But he had heard the magic words, you will never be a slave. And so he determined he would buy letters and words from poor children in the streets. He would bring them his extra bread. He was living with a more affluent owner and trade bread for letters. He became the foremost man of color of his time, spoke to Lincoln, had a huge family because some of his family discovered him after the Civil War and said they didn't have DNA testing in those days, but they persuaded Douglass that they were his kin. And so Douglass had to go on lecture tour and lecture tour, lecture tour to help support this humongous family and their children. And of course, his sons and his son-in-law did not have the fascinating history that he had, or maybe the speaking skills that he had to make a successful living. I mean, racism was rampant then. Next. Very interesting were the governor of New York, William Seward, and his wife, Frances. And William Seward was sure that he was going to win against Abraham Lincoln, but guess what? He did lose, and Lincoln put him into his cabinet. But he was definitely against slavery, and he married Frances, who had been educated in a Quaker meeting house, Quaker schools. So the two of them, and if you have a chance to get to their home in Albany, New York, in the basement there's a kitchen where he entertained and helped fugitives. Whether those fugitives came from Moses Pierce, we don't know. We can't prove that. Next. Now, this, I've been talking about all the wonderful people who were helping the fugitives, but there was terrible division in America at that time, much of it reminding me of what's happening today. And this Pennsylvania Hall was built by abolitionists, white and black, to celebrate freedom and abolition. And the day after it was opened, somebody firebombed it. The police stood by, the fire department stood by, did not really help. And escaping from the flames were Black and white persons, arm in arm. It was never rebuilt. Next. Another wonderful person was Lydia Maria Child. She had married a man who was a ne'er-do-well, so she had to become a writer, which she did. She wrote The Frugal Housewife, which was a very popular book. All kinds of recipes, one of which I once used, nice cookies. But once she declared her interest in abolition, the sale of her book plummeted. She lived with the Carpenters for 8 months and then again for 2 years. And we have a correspondence between her and Esther, who was a young girl when Lydia Maria Child lived there. Now, Lydia Maria Child, I have to give credit to one of my colleagues, Jean Fagan Yellen, who discovered that the autobiography of Harriet Jacobs was in fact an autobiography, and Lydia Maria Child had helped Harriet Jacobs publish that autobiography. Don't miss it, a wonderful book. when uh, uh, when the attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown happened, the governor of Virginia said he was a traitor. We've got to kill him right away. We got to kill all his relatives. And Lydia Maria Child said, no, he was a hero. He was a martyr. And she spent 300,000, she printed out 300,000 copies of her correspondence to persuade Americans that John Brown was a hero. Next. Terrible, terrible event. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. There had been a fugitive slave law in the late 1800s, but this one was just terrible, giving all kinds of bounty to people who managed. And I hope you have all seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. Any person of color could be grabbed, even if he was free. I mean, even if he had papers proving that he had bought his freedom, what do you do with paper? You throw it in the fireplace. So it was a terrible, terrible law. And we know that Moses and Esther were very interested in ending that slave law because they named their daughter Lydia Maria Child 3 months after the passage of this fugitive slave law, which gave bounty to people who brought people into slavery. Next. I don't know how many of you read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in 1852, that was 2 years after the fugitive slave law. You see, there was a lot of controversy in America, and her book sold 10,000 copies in the first week and 300,000 copies in its first year. Next. And I remember reading Uncle Tom's Cabin as a teenager, and I guess this image still sort of brings tears to my eyes. Next. Here's John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which many historians credit with starting the Civil War. John Brown had asked Frederick Douglass to help him. And Frederick Douglass said, you know, John, I like you very much. I like your idea, but I don't think it's a good idea. So after the raid, Frederick Douglass had to flee to England, where he had many friends and supporters, because American marshals were convinced. You see, he was such a prominent person already. American marshals were convinced that he was guilty, and so he had to flee, and 2 years later, he was able to come back. Next. Very fascinating man was David Ruggles, born free in Connecticut. You see how light-skinned he is in this portrait of him. He moved to New York with the purpose of helping enslaved, the fugitives. And he stayed with Joseph Carpenter 1841 to 1842 while he was recovering from his illnesses. Notice when he died at the age of 39. He died very young because he had suffered a lot of abuse and brutalization in New York, because he was part of the Vigilant Society that helped to prevent people from being captured in the Fugitive Slave Act. Next. Plymouth Church in Brooklyn was probably also influential. The fugitives probably stopped there. Henry Ward Beecher was a marvelous preacher there, fascinating biography, and he would raise money to free enslaved people. Next. This is the home of Elias Hicks built 1740 on the old Jericho Turnpike in Jericho, Long Island. And it is now a daycare center. Next. So I'm assuming that many of the fugitives who arrived in Pleasantville had stopped, were helped by David Hicks, Elias Hicks. And then you have to imagine what it felt like. You know, the enslaved were never taught to swim because that was a survival tactic. To get on a skiff, a sailboat at night, and in this deep Long Island Sound, and make it to Westchester County, Premium Point, or Glen Island near New Rochelle. Next. And there they were met by Esther's father, Joseph Carpenter of New Rochelle. And Joseph Carpenter was such an ardent abolitionist that he had a photograph taken of him with this little black child and distributed around to show that African Americans and whites can be friends, that whites can be friendly to African Americans. He had an incident in his church, at his meeting house, where some of the Quakers said, you know, Joseph, we really like you, but please ask that black child to stay outside while we have our meeting. So Joseph said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'll be happy to leave the meeting, and I'm not going to let the child be alone. So you can have your meeting without me. Well, they respected him enough and liked him enough that they decided that he should be allowed back in with the child. And next. And Carpenter, one of the issues for the enslaved and the freed black persons was where to bury them. Even though they had been converted to Christianity, Christian burial grounds did not make room for them. So Joseph Carpenter gave a huge field in New Rochelle to bury the enslaved. And there's estimated 450 enslaved people, or African Americans, buried there. Quakers do not have any tombstones, at least they didn't back then. So the two stones that are there, the two white stones, are for some two Huguenots, Bonnet. Joseph and his wife are assumed to be buried in the middle, but there is no stone marking it. And of course, over time, somebody said, gee, that's a nice little property. Let's develop that. Let's build a housing development there. And fortunately, New Rochelle was able to preserve it and has now become a a national landmark, so nobody can build on it. Nobody can put a football field there. When I photographed this, you can see what it is. It's totally abandoned, full of brambles. I went there with Patrick Raftery, and we photographed it in March before the brambles had a chance to get too big. Next. This is a Methodist meeting house in Pleasantville. Beautiful building. I love the building. On Bedford Road, on the way to Thornwood and ShopRite. You can see it there. And the Methodists had abolitionists come and speak in Pleasantville, and they even allowed African Americans to worship in their meeting house under the steps. So you see, the bias was still persistent, but at least they were allowed into the church. Next. Here's the draft riot in New York, 1863. 50 houses were burned, 11 blacks were beaten and then lynched, and they attacked the African American orphanage. I think it lasted like 4 days, and Lincoln had to bring in soldiers to stop the riot. Now, the soldiers, you see, the draft riot, the problem was that the soldiers, many of them were Irish who had escaped Ireland and were looking for work in America. And there were signs in the streets in New York saying no Irish need apply. And so the Irish did not want to risk their lives to free the enslaved so that they would have competition in jobs. And so that was a terrible, terrible event. Next. This is the Friends Meeting House at 420 Quaker Road in Chappaqua. Do go in there, and the top floor you will, and the upstairs you will see the photograph. They are photographs. The question that was asked, honestly, I don't know. I just pursued Esther and Moses. I don't know if there were stops in Briarcliff. And right now I'm realizing that I did not include the home of Moses Pierce that he purchased just before he married Esther. The home of Moses Pierce is in Thornwood. If you stand with your back to CVS, you will see a very ugly truck and car repair place. And there's an a colonial home with those little tiny eyebrow windows under the roof. And that was the home that Moses owned and where he sheltered fugitives. I wish Pleasantville could buy it and make it a tourist attraction. Next. One of the people we have mentioned is William Jay, the son of the first Supreme Court Justice, who, which was the next stop after Moses Pierce in Pleasantville. And the Jays were interesting because they were Anglicans. So they were not Quakers. They had been I don't know if William Jay was educated by Quakers, but they certainly, many of them were. So they definitely had abolitionist sentiments. And at the Jay homestead, there's a news clipping, a letter that Jay wrote to Moses. And these letters would be published in several abolitionist newspapers. And somebody, probably Jay, had crossed out a word and put in sinful laws. So, you know, the religious feeling was very clear that enslavement of human beings was against the will of God, even if you were an Anglican. Next. This is John Jay Jr. And notice his dates, 1817 to 1894. And Moses was born 1 year earlier and died a little bit earlier too. John and Moses and Esther named their first son John Jay. So this is all evidence that Moses was a staunch abolitionist and very dedicated to the Jays, and that the fugitives that came from Pleasantville traveled to the Jay homestead. Now, you see, this was tricky because these were lawyers, and so these were, and the fugitives were breaking the law. Anybody who helped a fugitive was helping thieves. So, so when I first researched this, the Jay Homestead said, no, there were no fugitives here. But since then, I think things have gotten a little more information has come out, and we'll see a letter later. Next. The next stop after the Jay Homestead, and they're all separated about 30 miles. I have to try that in a horse and buggy, but I never did. This is the Oblong Friends Meeting House on Quaker Hill in Pauling. And in 1769, freeing of enslaved workers became mandatory for all members. David Irish attended meeting here, and fortunately I was able to get inside, and it is stupendous inside. It is huge. It has 2 stories of seating, and we can assume that it seats probably at least 600 people. It doesn't look very impressive, but you'll be amazed what's inside. So these were the Quakers that had come from Long Island originally and settled in Pauling, and helped to spark the abolitionist movement and the manumission. Next. And this is the man who was related to Moses Pierce, David Irish. He lived on Quaker Hill. His sister married Moses's brother. You see, there was a very close family connections. And David Irish published a self-justification, self-condemn, a dialogue, which you can find on Google Books. Look up David Irish and you can see what he was talking about. He's debating with himself whether slavery is acceptable. And of course he decides that it is absolutely not acceptable. Next. This is a piece of information, evidence that I just recently acquired from the Anti-Slavery History Project in Troy, New York. And it's written by Harriet Myers. And she says, 2 fugitives arrived here that you sent, and I sent them immediately on their route for Canada in this month. it's hard to read this because there's no punctuation. We have had 10 we have sent on, 2 that you sent, sir. They had some money. They said that you gave them some. They had enough to get to Canada. I thank you for all the favors you've done for the downtrodden that come to this office. May God bless you, sir, and your posterity. So the Underground History Project in Troy has the handwritten letter, but we typed it up for the presentation because it's a little easier to read next. And this is the Myers residence that the Anti-Slavery History Project in Albany and Troy purchased, and they've been refurbishing it. And it was owned by Stephen Myers, an African-American, a free African-American. And it is now a documented station of the Underground Railroad and listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Here's a photograph of him. We don't have a photograph of her, but he was very active. Next. Well, the next stop after Albany, we don't know, could have been, as we discussed, the home of the governor of New York. We don't know. From Albany, they went north and tried to get to the Suspension Bridge, which was built 1848. I don't know what people did before that. They probably crossed in canoe. I would not want to cross the Niagara River in a canoe. And from Albany to Buffalo today, it's 285 miles, 93 hours, 2 days walking. Once they were in Canada, Canada had ended slavery in 1833, thanks to Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano met with Wilberforce, and Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano spoke to the English Parliament to end enslavement and to talk about, you should read his autobiography, the conditions on the slave ship that he describes, unbelievable. Okay, that's it. Now they're free in Canada. However, you have to think about, here they were, they didn't have many clothes. Certainly they were used to a warm climate. And once they were in Canada, and many of them ended up in St. Catharines, they had to count on friendly Canadians to hire them, give them food, shelter, clothing, and welcome them. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, we have an unbelievable amount of knowledge. It was amazing. I just was like overwhelmed. But let's ask, there's probably a lot of questions here. I didn't look at any of them as you were talking, and I know you did too. So do you have the ability to look at the chat function?
I'll try.
Okay. But I do have one question from one of the patrons asked me. What resources did you find most helpful in doing your historical research into the Underground Railroad?
Well, the resource that I found most helpful was my dear friend, right now I can't even remember his name, but Karsten Johnson. He was village historian and archivist, and he kept giving me all kinds of pointers of where to look, where to think, and so forth. The other is that once you get, the fun about research is once you get a little door open, then a whole lot of other doors open. There may well have been a stop in Ossining, but not from Moses Pierce. So, I had to limit my research because otherwise, or I did limit my research. I'd love to learn more about, I did go to Peekskill to read. There's a church there where they say there's a little closet where Harriet Tubman was. And somebody told me, oh yeah, definitely Harriet Tubman stopped in Pleasantville. Well, you know what? I researched every bit I could, and there's no evidence that Harriet Tubman, good as she was, stopped in Pleasantville. I wish I could say that.
Somebody asked if there was in Scarsdale on Route 22. Do you know anything about that?
I have heard about that. I've heard that there's a burial ground in Scarsdale, also in White Plains near Silver Lake. I remember taking a hike there, and there were all kinds of little rocks there, and somebody said this is an African burial ground, but it has not been protected in any way that I know of.
Okay, well, that just about ends all the questions. If you have any questions, please type them in chat now, and we could answer them. If not, wait a second or two. I want to thank you, Dorothee, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this program. I know a lot of people couldn't make it this time, but we've recorded it, and it's going to be on the website. So you go to chappaqua.library.org, and you scroll down on the home page till you see a screen, and underneath it, Chappaqua Library programs and lectures. So everybody will be able to see this program, and because you had a lot of information that people might want to write down, so they could go and revisit the entire program and write down the necessary information. So I thank you all.
I want to apologize for not having the photograph of Moses's house. I don't know what happened to that. So whoever was interested in that, I'll be happy to send it to.
That's wonderful. Okay, thank you all for coming, and please visit our website, which is chappaqua.library.org. And don't forget, on the 20th, we're having Harvard Professor Avi Loeb talking about extraterrestrial, the first signs of intelligent life beyond Earth. So thank you again, and we'll hope to see you all again. Bye-bye.